This is our last lesson in Chapter 2, 2.6 on proving statements about angles. So again, we have the reflexive, symmetric, and transitive properties that we saw with equality, that we saw with congruency with line segments. Now we're going to look at them with angles. Nothing changes. They're the same properties, except that instead of a line segment, we have angles. Something else we need to know is that all right angles are congruent. That should just be pretty much common sense. You know that. Nobody really should have to tell you that. So then we have a congruent supplements theorem that says that if two angles are supplementary to the same angle or to two congruent angles, then they are congruent. So if two angles are supplementary to the same angle, then they are congruent to each other. Well, if we have a 100-degree angle and we have two angles that are supplementary to that, well, they both have to be 80 degrees, so therefore they have to be congruent. The second says that if the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 equals 180 degrees, and the measure of angle 2 plus the measure of angle 3 equals 180 degrees, then angle 1 has to be congruent to angle 3. Again, hopefully you kind of see that. So if you were to set those two equal to each other, since they both equal 180, and then subtract out the measure of angle 1, you would get that they're equal to each other. And if two things are equal, then they're also congruent. So that's congruent supplements theorem. The congruent complements theorem should look very similar to the supplements theorem, except for we're talking about complementary angles. So if two angles are complementary to the same angle, or to two congruent angles, then those two angles are congruent to each other. So that if we have the measure of angle 4 plus the measure of angle 5 equals 90 degrees, and the measure of angle 5 plus the measure of angle 6 equals 90 degrees, just like we did above in the supplements theorem, we can set those two equal to each other, subtract out angle 5, and we find out that the measure of angle 4 is equal to the measure of angle 6. Okay. If two angles form a linear pair, then they're supplementary. And that's pretty much what linear pair, that's what we talked about. It even meaning is that they make a straight line. Well, if it makes a straight line, it has to be 180 degrees. Two angles that add up to 180 degrees are supplementary. Okay, the other is that vertical angles are congruent to each other. And we talked about that as well. Angles that are on opposite sides of a vertex are congruent. Okay, so here's an example, and we're going to be using those theorems from above. So now you've had some practice writing proofs yourself. And so what I would like you to do is to write your two-column proof given these pieces of information, that angle AFC and angle BFD are right angles, and that angle BFD is congruent to angle CFE. I want you to prove that angle AFC is congruent to angle CFE. Have that proof done. Do what you can. Remember, there's more than one way to write these proofs and to solve them. So write a proof. Make sure you use your previous steps in future steps, and don't use something until you've proven that it's true. So try that example. We'll talk about it tomorrow in class. Have a great evening.